Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, most of you right now are seeing reports that the Russians have launched a massive strike against the capital of Kiev, along with other areas of the Ukraine as well. Now, early reports indicate that hundreds of drones and upwards to between 60 and 90 quote-unquote missiles were utilized, including medium-range, large ballistic missiles as well. Now, what's interesting is you will hear at least some folks in the Russian circles talk about the Orshnik missile that was used, the one missile that was used. Again, the large ballistic missile system that was allegedly a demonstration of capability. Now, look, the Russians have quote-unquote demonstrated that capability a number of times. This is the most effective way to quote-unquote demonstrate capability. I don't know. Look, the whole concept of demonstrating capability, that's done with, right? You in this conflict, it is not about demonstrating capability. It's about executing with capability against a viable military or military-like target. So what caused all this? Let's zoom in here on the old map system, and I'll take you to a locale. Oh, I think I missed it here. Let's go back up. Here we go, right here. All right. So this locale here, you'll see a number of buildings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 buildings. I'm not sure what this facility was pre-war, but the Ukrainians, at least a few days ago, believed that this was a Russian FSB location. And allegedly, the Ukrainians believed that there were a large number of Russian intel figures, intel personnel, FSB personnel, that were assigned to this property in the Kherson area, just northeast of Crimea proper. I mean, some could consider it Crimea within the environs. And if you look at the videos that are out there of this strike, you can see that the Ukrainians and or NATO believed that there was a presence in this compound that required large numbers of drones with some fairly large warheads to take down and completely destroy this site. Now, the Ukrainians are estimating that 100 Russian service personnel from the FSB may have been killed or wounded in this attack, right? Now, not long after this strike is when we observed the Russian missile strike on Kiev. So we have to ask ourselves, did NATO / the Ukraine hit a fairly sensitive target? Were they successful? And the answer to that is quite possibly. Quite possibly. Something was hit that obviously got the attention of the Russian Federation, and then you saw the attack by the Russians just recently, within the last 24 hours, on Kiev. And again, a fairly significant strike. Now, look, the Ukrainians are saying that, I believe right now, the toll is 4 quote-unquote civilians killed, probably a few dozen wounded, just under 100 wounded, possibly, right? But look, the Ukrainians are not going to come out and say that the Russians struck a command and control node and killed large numbers of Ukrainian troops or military personnel in a specific locale. They're not going to do that. The Ukrainians do not talk about casualties at all in this conflict. I mean, it's gotten to the point. Well, they can't, because right now that's really the only positive that the Ukrainians are able to articulate in this conflict, right? Hey, we're killing a lot of Russians. We're losing territory. We're losing territory less fast now than we were a month ago, but we're taking out a lot of Russians, right? But at the same time, they're not going to talk about their casualty levels, which are significant. Significant. Look, if the Russians launch the better part of 1,000 munitions at Kiev, right, with 90 of them being either cruise missiles or ballistic missiles, Iskanders, KH-101s, Calibers, what have you, and then hundreds of larger drones with fairly large warheads that are striking targets all around Kiev, you have to believe that the casualty levels are going to be higher than just 4 Ukrainians killed and 70 or 80 wounded, right? So what you're not hearing from the Ukrainians, is the impact on military casualties that this recent strike has caused the Ukrainians. And you're not going to hear that, right? You're not going to hear about a bunker-busting intermediate range ballistic missile that strikes a very sensitive target. They're just not going to talk about it. And they're surely not going to give any sort of realistic casualty estimates or truthful casualty estimates. I mean, all that will take place post-conflict, maybe, right? We just don't know. So what we're saying here is essentially the Russians launched 1,000 weapon systems at Kiev, and what occurred from that attack is 4 Ukrainians dead and about 70 wounded. Maybe more, maybe less. I find that difficult to believe. So my guess is, yes, the Ukrainians hit something in Kherson. They hit a target, and it pissed the Russians off. And this is the response that we have seen from the Russian Federation that has just occurred, right? That is what has happened. Now, what's even more interesting is capability, right? We're seeing a different capability now in terms of Ukrainian capability than what existed at the start of the conflict back in 2022. Yeah, the Ukrainians had Bayraktars. They were able to launch strikes with those systems. My understanding now is the Russians have mitigated the Bayraktar threat, and they are essentially no longer operational. However, we are seeing new capabilities from the Ukrainians, right? We didn't see these kinds of capabilities that we saw in the Kherson FSB strike, or allegedly FSB strike, that was very well coordinated and very well executed, if in fact that was a legitimate military target, right? Were they able to do what they did to that site because it wasn't a military target, or was it in fact a military target that was maybe not adequately defended, that was struck by the Ukrainians? But the capability that the Ukrainians have shown in that strike was significant. that target was completely obliterated by those Ukrainian strikes. Now, was there bunkers? Was there hardened structure under those buildings? Difficult to say. If there was, then in all probability, is it possible that the Russian forces were able to get into those bunkers? Because it didn't look like, at least from the videos that I've seen, that the Ukrainians were utilizing kind of ground penetrating munitions that would have eliminated individuals under those structures, right? It was a surface-based attack. But it was successful. They destroyed those buildings, and if there were Russian service personnel in those buildings, then obviously there were in all probability casualties. Now, again, not long after that strike took place, we then see almost 1,000 Russian missiles and drones impacting around Kiev. So something happened. Something happened. And as always, the fighting continues. The fighting is relentless and ongoing. But it is interesting to see how, especially in terms of Ukrainian capability, the conflict is evolving. And you can see very much so the Ukrainians are receiving active support from Western nation states. You can see that technology that is being utilized in this conflict that was not present earlier in the conflict wasn't there, and we've seen this grow and take shape, and the Ukrainians now have a fairly robust and capable system of attacking both targets near and around the front line, but 100 miles behind the front line, and even much further. Are they large-scale strikes that can really impact the course of the war? And what I'm talking about, these are strategic strikes in nature, right? Against targets deep inside of the Russian Federation. The short answer to that is no. Right? You do hear about Ukrainian strikes that are taking place further north of in and around Moscow, north of Moscow, hundreds of miles beyond the scope of the area in which the conflict is taking place. But those strikes that we do see with these large, slow-moving, low-flying drones are not always as effective as they appear, right? It's something that is worth talking about, saying, hey, we struck a target deep inside the Russian Federation. But the reality is, what was the benefit of that strike? What was the objective? What were they trying to do? And was it effective? And ultimately, we really don't know, because the Russians really don't talk about the effectiveness of those strikes as well. Okay? But again, interesting to see how this is kind of escalating. And again, this conflict is not going to stop until one side has defeated the other side. And again, it's not going to stop. And quite possibly right now we're seeing what I call the shaping of escalation, right? The Russians now are talking about the Baltic states. They're saying, hey, look, the Baltic state, we believe the Baltic states are being used or could be used in some manner to strike the Russian Federation. And again, what I want to do is just real quick go back in history. Let's go back to 1990. Let's go back to 1989 during the collapse of the Soviet Union. If the Soviets and the Russians could have seen into the future and could have seen what is happening now in terms of NATO expansion into the Baltic states, the direct support by NATO in terms of directly supporting the Ukrainians would have history turned out differently. And I'm just asking this question, right? If the Soviets could see what is happening now, I'm guessing that the Soviet Union and Moscow would have used all means at its disposal to prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union, even if it had to go to war and crush the Baltic independence movement and the Ukrainian independence movement. I'm guessing that would have happened if the Soviets could see what is happening now. And it's interesting to kind of see, it's really interesting to kind of see history, right? To go back to the 80s and early 90s as the NATO expansion was first occurring, kind of into Poland and in other areas. And again, it was a very slow-moving process that took the shape of, this is just what we're doing. They want to join us. We have no eyes in terms of objectives of seeing the Baltic states in NATO, right? And that's when Poland was looking, right? And then once Poland is accepted, then it kind of moves. It moves further from there, and that's kind of what we were seeing, and that's what we have seen in this conflict. So, I mean, look, do the Russians have legitimate concerns? And I would say, yeah, they do. Again, if you go back and you look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you look at this mission creep of NATO further east, until finally, we were first looking at Warsaw Pact nation states, right? Non-Soviet republics that were joining NATO. And, at first, it was inconceivable that a Soviet republic would actually join NATO. Like, could you imagine back in '85 talking about, eventually a number of Soviet republics will be part of NATO. That was when, the Warsaw Pact existed, right? And there were multiple Soviet combined arms armies in Poland. Unthinkable. It was the Overton window at its extreme. Inconceivable, right? Now, look where we're at. Now you have to ask yourself, what's next? What part of the Overton window, right, continues to open wider, and what happens? What does that look like? Are we talking about what is the mission goal? What next for NATO? Is it the breakup of the Russian Federation? Is that what we're looking at? That's the question the Russians are asking right now, right? Remember, we were looking at, go back to the 90s, early 90s, late 80s, right? Inconceivable that a Soviet republic would become part of NATO. So the Russians are asking themselves, what's next? What's next? And you have to ask yourself that. You have to ask yourself that. Again, what we're looking at that is taking place in Eastern Europe right now, if the shoe was on the other foot and we were completely switching things, and let's say hypothetically that the Warsaw Pact had won the Cold War and capitalism fails in Western Europe and the United States, and hypothetically speaking, at some point the United States starts to disintegrate, and maybe Mexico joins the Warsaw Pact, and maybe the large Mexican population starts to revolt in Texas and parts of Texas, then want to join the Mexican-dominated Central American Warsaw Pact. Who knows, right? Again, I know this is essentially crazy talk, and it didn't happen and would not happen as of yet. But if you compare and contrast, it's kind of what did happen in terms of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the eventual NATO expansion further east into the actual Soviet republics. It's happening. And that's where we're at. And then the question is what are the Russians willing to do? Right? How far will they go to prevent further NATO expansion? If the Russians really believe that the Russian Federation is next, and you have to reasonably ask yourself, well, what would be next, right? If you're looking at an eastward push, what would be next? And again, this is the Russian viewpoint, and you have to understand the viewpoint of your adversary. You have to understand his motivations. And unfortunately, here in the United States, we don't get a very good picture, an accurate picture of what is motivating the Russian Federation. All you hear about here in the United States is that the Russians are going to invade Poland, right? That's not going to happen. That capability does not exist right now for the Russians to invade Poland. I've seen some of these other content providers. They're able to create this this scenario by limited movement of forces into Belarus that then creates that conversation. Well, the Russians are going to invade Poland. Could the Russians invade the Baltics and seize a Baltic state? Maybe. But militarily, right now, the Russians don't have that capability to invade Poland. Poland is not going to be a target other than if there was a conflict between NATO and Russia. You would not see Russian tanks moving into Poland. You would see maybe Russian missile strikes on Poland, but I don't believe you would see a direct Russian armored thrust into Poland right now. Not going to happen. Baltic states, maybe, but highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. Right now, the Russian objective is the Ukraine. Now, what happens after that? Where are we at in 5 years? It's difficult to say, but NATO's making its own bed right now in terms of its relationship with the Russians. If you think that the Russian people or the Russian government, whatever that looks like 5 years from now, maybe the same, maybe different, you think that's going to have any concept of reconciliation with NATO? I don't think so. That ship has sailed. And what happens next? Boy, it's in a 10-year time frame, it's really tough to say. Because you have to go back to late 1980s, early 1990s, and then fast forward to where we're at now. I don't think anyone would have believed that what's happening now would have happened in the late 80s, right? So we can't even fathom what the planet looks like in another 10 years, where things could go. Who knows? Maybe we're not even here. Maybe Kiev renames itself the town of Bedrock. Have a good day.